Hello, everyone. Welcome to New Directors, New Films, presented by Film at Lincoln Center and the Museum of Modern Arts in New York. I am La Francis Hui. I am the co-chair of this year's festival and also a film curator at MoMA. Joining me here is the director of Days of Cannibalism, Teboho Edkins. Hi.
Hello. Hi, thanks for having me.
It is such a pleasure to include in our festival a film that takes us to Lesotho, a small country with a population of about 2 million that's situated within the South African border. We rarely, if ever, learn anything about this place, but as this documentary demonstrates, no small place is untouched by the force of globalization. And this film gives us an insightful view of how life is changed as a result of the arrival of Chinese businesses, a scenario that is actually mirrored in other parts of the world as well. Director Atkins was born in what he called a hippie little place in Tennessee in the United States, but he really grew up in Lesotho. And he also has lived in France and Germany, and he is now speaking to us from Berlin. You have quite a global presence yourself. Can you begin by telling us how you got interested in making this film?
Okay. um, well, actually, as I grew up in Lesotho, I was quite curious and mystified about these Chinese business people coming to the country. And it's not as if there was a wave of them, but they kind of like had little shops in very remote areas, and one met them in the most difficult to reach places, you know?
When did they start arriving?
I think first it was Taiwanese actually. There was a wave of Taiwanese, and then there are business people from more like the Beijing area, and now they're all from Fujian, from the Fujian province. So they're Fujianese now. But when I was growing up, it was more Taiwanese actually. Um, so I was always a bit mystified, and in the same way, the Basutu were always quite curious about them because one doesn't really. It was quite difficult to communicate because the language wasn't the same, and there was always this sort of respect that one found them in the craziest places. So I had this idea in the back of my mind for a long time that I wanted to do something with them, and then I went to live in Hong Kong for a while, and I spent some time in Guangzhou, and there I was staying in this hotel with African traders, business people from Africa coming to China, and that's sort of when the whole thing came together, and I understood, okay, I could kind of create a film which maybe began in China and ended in Africa, or in Lesotho in this case.
Hmm.
So I've been working on the film for about 7 years, I think. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And how did you build your relationship with your subjects, both the Basutu and the Chinese? And what did you tell them? What you were trying to do? What your objectives were?
Hmm. Well, it's funny because when you make a film with groups that are so culturally, that live in completely different cultural spheres, such as the Basutu and the Chinese, you have a different way of communicating with them. For instance, the Basutu were really interested in what kind of film I was making and what I wanted to film, and they kind of wanted to present themselves from their best side, or they're kind of curious about the image. And the Chinese were really not interested in what I was doing. They were just happy to have me and happy to be together. But what I was actually filming, I tried to explain to them a few times why I was there and what I was interested in. But they weren't, once the boss had said it was fine, it's okay that I'm there. It was I was totally accepted.
Hmm.
So I spent I visited them over 2-3 years to build up the connections. Like it was really about building up the relationship before I started actually filming the film with my crew.
Hmm.
And with the Basutu, I really went through the ministries. I went through the Ministry of Police. I went through, Department of Correctional Services, the Ministry of Justice. I went through the proper channels, to get permission to film with the officials. Whereas with the Chinese family, it was there was a local person, a local Musutu Chinese or Chinese man who grew up in Lesotho who kind of opened the doors for me. Yeah.
Hmm. It's quite obvious that the people didn't mind your presence. I mean, your camera is really everywhere. You filmed the herders in the mountains, and you went into the living quarters of the Chinese families. and you even filmed in a courtroom. Can you talk about how you embedded yourself in all these situations?
Um, well, a lot of the way I film is I call it a little bit like I'm maybe directing reality. It's not for instance, the courtroom. It's not a real courtroom session.
Oh, wow.
I was not allowed to film a courtroom in progress because the magistrate said there might be some issue about people would feel that it was unfair the way they were treated because the camera was there. So I kind of recreated the setting. Like I workshopped a case with the magistrate and the prosecutor and the accused, and we improvised the whole thing within a day.
But did they play themselves?
They played themselves, yeah, of course, yeah.
Interesting. So, did it happen a lot in the film? I'm especially interested in one scene when it was shot in the middle of the night when the police knocked
Yeah,
on the door to
yeah.
look for missing cattle. It's like, how were you there?
Well, in fact, that was one scene where I really was there. Um, we went on a raid with them, and we walked all night with the police looking for cattle, and a lot of it's just sound because we couldn't film anything, and like I was kind of I think in this almost most of the film is real, like 95%. I mean, it really is the courtroom scene that is staged in a sense. But for instance, the CCTV footage, right, with the girl in pink. I mean, it's such a perfectly directed scene, right?
The
With
CCTV, you were talking about the robbery?
the robbery.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, the CCTV camera, with the girl in pink on her little scooter and the attack all around. And I mean, it's too perfectly executed to be real, but it totally happened. Yeah.
Huh. Can you talk a little bit more about directing reality, which is something that we don't often deal with in documentary, but it is done.
Mm.
And can you talk about whether it is something you thought a lot about?
Yeah, I often work with kind of like moving between fiction and documentary in my films, because in fact, I mean, the film itself, I think, feels a bit like a fiction film, in the sense that the scenes, it's really built in scenes, and it's not. It's like, so what I often do is, right. Let me go back one step. So what I often do is I find a concept, a kind of a clear concept, that I want to make. For instance, in the past, I made gangster films, which were documentaries with gangsters.
Okay.
And in this case, I wanted to make a Western. And I decided almost before I began filming that I was going to make a Western. And because the filming process often takes years, and there's no main character in the film, there's no plot as such, there's not one sort of story or development I'm following. It's really the concept that is helping guide me how to make my film. So within the concept, I sort of think, okay, I need a Western, and then I kind of I try to figure out, okay, so a Western needs certain elements, and then I kind of find them and bring them into my film.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Um, can you we hardly see a scene when there's like a warm interaction between the Basutu and the Chinese. The Chinese store owners always look kind of tense when they're dealing with the customers. And we hear a musician, he sings about the abuse of the Chinese.
Mm,
There is one scene though that in which the radio host, he kind of lightheartedly mentions how nice it would be for the Basutu to teach the Chinese about cattle and the Chinese
mm, 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 mm.
about running a business. I'm wondering whether in reality there's any indication that people really want to reach out to each other in the spirit of learning and sharing.
Mm. Honestly, not very much. And I've been trying to understand what is happening. And it's a very practical relationship between the Basutu and the Chinese. Um, I mean, the Chinese that I've also, I mean, there are obviously many different types of Chinese, you know, and I mean, there are many different, I mean, they're kind of like large government projects like roads or stadiums, or, you know, which involves the Chinese state. But the Chinese that I was working with are just small families or large families that build up businesses and that involve just their families, and they're completely separate from the Chinese government, and they're quite proud to be separate. Um, and so they're there to work, you know, they're there to do business, and there's one or two kind of the family head who's in Lesotho for maybe 20 years, and then he brings cousins and uncles and nephews and nieces, and they come for 3-4 years, and they go back to China. So they come and they do their work, and then they leave again. So there's not much incentive for them to build a life in Lesotho.
Hmm.
And what happens a lot is that they're quite fearful, you know, of violence, because there's an awful lot of violence that happens against these Chinese migrant workers, you know, and they're a little bit treated like, in Germany you'd say vogelfrei. They outside the law, you know. It's sort of because there's a sort of resentment that the Basutu feel that they are making money, and they're not really, so there's a rumor they're not paying taxes, or they're not integrating themselves into the local society. They can be attacked, and the police don't actually do much about it.
Wow.
So this is sort of this kind of sense of lawlessness, you know, this sort of space where anything can happen, which is why I felt that it was a Western, you know.
Exactly.
It's
Mhm.
because, I mean, you have all the elements of the Western. You have the pioneers, you know, you have the settlers, you have the sort of sense of gold rush, and you have this kind of time or space where the rules are a little bit in flux. You know, one is not quite sure who's in control. The power is changing hands, um, and it's kind of beyond the law, you know. And that's why it's like it's a frontier landscape, you know. It's a frontier landscape. There are new encounters, new morals, you know. The whole thing is kind of in flux and changing, and that's why I call it a Western, you know. And which also means that the Chinese kind of like barricade themselves in their little houses, and are fearful of the kind of the outside, uh, and this creates a sort of sense of being constantly under threat and under attack.
Hmm.
And then sorry, and then there's and so there's very little space other than business where they interact, you know. And it's quite, and I was thinking that I was trying to understand, why is this, you know, what's happening. And I spoke to a Chinese man in Lesotho, and he told me that he thought that because there's no common history between the Africans and the Chinese, the Africans only knew about China through the Western lens, and vice versa. China only knew about Africa through the West, the gaze of the Western lens. So this is the first time these two cultures are actually meeting face to face, right? There's no common history, and it's sort of like a fresh encounter. But because it happens within a mercantile business environment, it is purely practical. And that kind of, you know, so it's this direct encounter, quite rude and quite violent in some ways, but also quite honest, because it's just about, you know, what can I get from you? What can you give me?
Hmm.
Yeah.
And is it because that you had in your mind, like you were kind of filming a Western, a fiction, a genre film in a way, that you didn't opt for doing direct interviews?
Yeah. I mean, exactly. I mean, it was, I wanted it to function as like a fiction film. You know, it was quite clear from the beginning there was not going to be any interviews in the film.
And I'm wondering how the Chinese feel about their own presence and their obvious privilege.
Mm.
It's creating a lot of resentment, as we can see from the film.
Well, what's so interesting, I mean, because growing up there, I was more on the side of the Basutu. You know, I didn't know who the Chinese were, and I kind of, and there are all these sort of cliches, you know, all these Chinese are, you know, they're here, they're making money, they're just like, you know, they're rich back home, you know, they don't, you know, they're rude. And then spending time with the Chinese, I kind of, I really developed an empathy for their lives, which are extremely difficult, you know, and they're not living in luxury at all, you know. The money they make, they save very carefully and send back to China, but they don't necessarily come by choice. They come by for economic necessity, and they're basically they're basically just very scared and quite lonely, you know, and under quite a lot of tension the whole time, you know. So there's a bit of, there's a lot of drinking, because there's nothing else to do, and there's sort of underlying melancholy, like a kind of melancholic sadness, you know, which I found very touching.
Hmm.
And I really felt for them, you know. I mean, I kind of like really bonded because it's not an easy life they're doing there, and I have the greatest respect for the courage that they have in going out and looking for a better future.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are big Chinese corporations like building roads and infrastructure there, but the people that you film, they are small business people, and they are probably people actually squeezed out of the Chinese economy.
They haven't finished school, many of them, you know, like they're very uneducated back in China, you know. They feel, I mean, I don't know if you know much about Fujian, the province, but they have this long history of going out
Yes.
and you know, kind of, it's quite a wild place, you know. You have these kind of these families, clans, and these triad structures, I think, still, you know, and a little bit kind of like a kind of a tribe apart within China, I think.
Yeah.
And maybe in modern China there's not so much space for them at the moment, you know.
Hmm.
And that's why but it is really not easy, you know, what they're doing, and they are quite, I mean, they do it without complaining, you know, and with the kind of the greatest respect within their community.
I am wondering whether the Basutu think that the average Basutu, I mean, there must be some rich ones that are pretty well off, but the average ones, do they feel like they benefit from the investments from the
From the
foreigners?
Chinese, from the
Yeah.
foreigners? Yes, I mean, yeah, I mean, what happened? All right, so I have this interesting story where I was getting friendly with one of the women who worked in the Chinese shops, and she had just quit that day. You know, she quit, and she's like, "Oh my God, you know, these Chinese, they're exploiting me. I don't get paid enough. You know, it's really tough work. You know." And I immediately kind of like, "Oh, you know, yeah, it's really horrible when people exploit you and this awful capitalism they bring and so on." And I kind of asked her, "Okay, so what are you going to do now?" And she said, and I said, "Look, there's another shop that opened up opposite the Chinese, and it's run by Basutu." And I was like, "You know, with your experience, maybe you could get a job there." And she said, "Yeah, you know, I would. You know, I'd go to the Basutu and get a job there. You know, but the problem is, I won't get paid anything at all." You know, it's like the Chinese, they pay her, but not very much. And with the Basutu, you know, they may be nice to her, but she doesn't get paid at all. You know, or she never knows when she'll get paid. You know, so it's sort of like within the capitalism that is happening, and that is not necessarily the fault of the Chinese at all, you know, but it is sort of the modern world that is encroaching on this infrastructure or this old life there. People lose out, you know. And I think that's really what the film is about. It's about this sort of the traditional economy of cows and all around that being supplanted by the forces of globalization. And everyone tries to ride these waves, but you know, it's not everyone succeeds, and it's not a happy situation, really.
Yeah. And I want you to talk a little bit more. You mentioned earlier about the violence, and we see the presence of firearms, and how dangerous is this place? You talked about Western. And
Hmm.
if you can tell us a little bit more about the robbery that we see in the film.
Well, I think Lesotho has one of the highest murder rates in the world,
Oh, wow.
but it doesn't feel dangerous for some reason. I think it's if I think it's dangerous in the sense that the smallest argument results in great violence, you know. So so what happened with the robbery was that it was on the 18th. I mean, it was the day of the World Cup final, the football World Cup final
Uh-huh.
in in 2018, and I really needed a scene with the Chinese family. Like, it was kind of like a little bit difficult because we're just filming them working and there's not much else happening in their life. You know, we'd film their evenings and we'd be with them at work, and they kind of felt like, you know, they couldn't offer us much more, you know, and it was a bit sort of like, you know, what can we do with you now? And I thought maybe we could all watch the World Cup final together, you know. I thought maybe that would be create a nice scene. So, and the match was supposed to start at 5 o'clock, and at 4:30, we were sort of hanging around there waiting for them to finish work, and I was sort of really praying for a final scene. I needed a scene with the characters, you know. And then what happened was we were all robbed, you know. And they robbed us at that time because everyone, the police, the whole town would be watching the football game.
Oh, you were there.
Yeah, I'm the one who takes the child.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. I didn't realize.
Yeah, it's yeah, we're all there together.
I see. And what happened afterwards?
Well, we're sort of like, you know, we're kind of tied up and beaten a bit, you know, because there were some complications about getting the money, and then they kind of put us into a room, and they left with my camera, for instance, and as much money as they could take. And
Okay.
then and then we kind of untied each other and managed to get to the hospital. So it was quite bonding, you know, and quite, in retrospect, a really important moment because it created a bond between protagonists and I, and it's a fantastic scene, you know, and I make an appearance in the film.
You were quite a hero, huh?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, so my prayers were answered.
I mean, the film overall it provides a rather grim view of globalization and the cruelty of the global marketplace. Some poor countries do need foreign investments, but the result can be devastating. Um, what do you want the audience to think about or to act on? Or maybe we just feel bad about.
No, don't feel bad. I think it's about creating empathy. You know, I really try to show respect and love for the people within my film, and if the audience has empathy, then that's and understands a little bit what that everyone's going through. Because when I showed the film at the Berlin Film Festival, there's some Chinese journalists who were really interested because they were as curious about what the Chinese were doing in Africa as everyone else is, you know. And they kind of had like, you know, oh my God, I had no idea it was so difficult, you know, and like, you know, respect for the Fujianese who are going out there and risking their lives to make a living. So something like, you know, if like one has empathy for that, then that's good, yeah. And also a sort of, I wanted to show a kind of the dignity, you know, the dignity of the Basutu and the kind of the dignity of the life of the shepherd, you know, and I mean, we haven't spoken about I know it's maybe my favorite topic. It's about the meaning of the cow
Huh?
in Basutu culture.
Mhm.
So if you'll indulge me,
Of course.
um, uh, if you don't have money, you invest. There's no bank, right? So you invest your money in cows because that's like a retirement fund. Yeah. And if you negotiate a dowry, you know, like a bridal price between families, you pay in
Mhm.
cows, you know.
Mm.
And it's kind of but you never pay the full amount. You kind of like say, okay, I'll give you 10 cows, but you only give 5. And then next year you come back and say, look, I gave you 5, but one has given birth to a small one, you know. And it's a way to keep communication going between culture, between families, right? The cow. And it's sacrificed for, or it marks important weddings and funerals. And, you know, the cow is really important on all sorts of metaphysical, symbolic, and practical levels. So it's much more than just an animal. There's a kind of a whole myth and kind of a mystique attached to the cow. And so that's why I needed to show a cattle, the whole cattle theft. You know, I needed to show how cows are stolen, and the court case is all about, you know, cows being stolen. Because if you steal the cows of somebody, you don't just take his money, you take a slice of his personhood, right? Because you're a person through your animals. So if you steal someone's animals, you take a part of their personhood, you know, and that is the act of cannibalism that the title refers to.
I was
It's
going to ask
how
you that.
exactly, you know, so if you go, so you know, if you steal a cow, you go to prison for a year for each cow. For each cow, you get a year's prison sentence. You know, it's completely draconian, but that's because cows are so important. But what's happening now, or like what's happened in the last 2-3 years, is that the Chinese business people are starting to invest in cows themselves, right? And but they're just investing in cows. They're not taking care of the cows. They're not like becoming shepherds. Even though the radio presenter would, you know, like in his utopian vision, he would love the Chinese become shepherds themselves and the cultures to assimilate, and you know that's how things should be. But in fact, you know, because of the modern capitalist society we live in, you know, if you arrive in that place with money, you kind of just invest in cows and you pay a shepherd, and you're now owner of cattle, but you never see your animals, and that destroys the whole mystique, the whole essence of the cow. And that is why the cow sacrificed in the film. You see the head of the cow. It's the death of the god, you know, the death of the god with the wet nose. And this is what I really wanted to show, how the economic system that existed, you know, around the cow, this complex kind of strange economic coin, which is the cow, is being put into question and destroyed by the arrival of money, you know, of global capital, and how this creates uncertainty, violence, you know, how systems are in flux and societies change because of these forces of globalization. And that's why the cow is so central to the film.
And it is exactly what your film can do, is to show the Chinese, like, well, perhaps they could be more sensitive about the situation the Basutu are in, like when the cows are being purchased by them as just a
Possibly. I mean, on one hand, I think it's refreshing that the Chinese say, look, this is your life. You know, we are here to make money and we don't want to have anything to do with your system. Because if you think of the missionaries that came 100 years ago, you know, they kind of like they were a little bit too interested in the lives of the Basutu, and decided to kind of convert them to Christianity and really change the system, you know. So by the Chinese kind of not really involving themselves in their lives, in a way they kind of coexist, you know, without kind of eating them up too much, you know. There's so much tension that comes with it, of course.
One final question: has this film been screened in Lesotho and in China, or to these people?
Yeah, not yet. I mean, because of the whole COVID situation.
Right.
But I'll be going to Lesotho next. Well, I'm going to South Africa next week, and then hopefully up to Lesotho in the beginning of the year. And I look forward.
There's a lot of social distancing there.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of space. And just the Days of Cannibalism refers to a bar, in fact.
Oh, okay.
A bar in the town called Days of Cannibalism.
Oh.
So it's a big title. It's a heavy title. So I wasn't really sure if I was going to keep it until the end of the film. It was always a working title because it's quite loaded, right? It's sort of, you think of, you know, people eating other people but it guided me a lot in making my film, because there are lots of acts of cannibalism happening. You know, there's the economic cannibalism, there's the situation with the cows, there's economic cannibalism. So yeah, that's why it's called Days of Cannibalism. And then the cows eating their ancestors at the end, right?
Yes, I remember that. And well, congratulations. This is an incredible film, and I hope a lot of people get to see it. And I hope I will eventually meet you in person.
Yeah, I hope so too. And thank you very much for selecting it and your appreciation.
Thank you.